Welcome. Well, we call this hearing on the Joint Economic Committee to order. The title that we've selected for this hearing is What We Do Together, the State of Social Capital in America. I want to thank each of our witnesses and our committee members for joining us today. Our nation today faces very real economic challenges. As we heard during our committee's hearing last month, economic growth during the recovery has been meager and uneven. The U.S. economy has become less dynamic and innovative than in recent decades. We miss the strong productivity growth America enjoyed in the mid-20th century and the unusually large wage gains it brought. However, in historical and comparative perspective, most Americans enjoy unprecedented material living standards. Our economic problems often take the form of unsatisfactory rates of improvement. We're growing richer less quickly than we did when we were poorer. Nevertheless, many Americans, poor, middle class, and wealthy, feel that something in our society is amiss. It's a feeling that cannot be reduced to economic anxiety. Rather, there is a sense that our social fabric in America is fraying. And these concerns are reflected in objective measures of family and community health. To cite just a few of the trends that may be grouped under the rubric of social capital, marriage and church-going have declined, distrust of the nation's institutions has grown, mixed-income neighborhoods have become rarer, regional polarization has increased, and young men who are neither working nor looking for work have become more numerous and more isolated. We do less together than in the past, and we're worse off for it economically and otherwise. Today's hearing, along with a new report released on Monday, launches the Social Capital Project, a multi-year research effort that I've established in the Vice Chairman's office. The project will investigate the health of the bonds of family, faith, community, and work that define our lives. An emphasis on social capital complements the economic lens through which we typically view national challenges today. Many of our ostensibly economic problems reflect the withering of our associational life. For example, the fragility of so many families today reduces upward mobility, and diminishing trust has implications for the decline in business dynamism, since risk-taking requires confidence in each other and our institutions. Economic trends, in turn, affect the extent to which we cooperate to achieve our desired goals. The project's inaugural report, What We Do Together, concludes that rising affluence has reduced the economic necessity of having close ties with neighbors and traditional institutions. It also highlights the extent to which the growth in two-worker families has affected investment in social capital. These economic changes have conferred valuable benefits, to be sure, but by depleting social capital, they have also come with costs. The twin pillars of American freedom, a free enterprise economy and a voluntary civil society, exist and operate within the vital space between the government and the individual, where organic communities form and networks of economic opportunity and social cohesion are built. It is my hope that the Social Capital Project will start a new conversation for our country that emphasizes social solidarity and mutual cooperation. As we face today's economic challenges, policymakers should ask how we can empower civil society and what government should or should not do to thicken the middle layers between the individual and the state. I now turn to the ranking member, Senator Heinrich, for his opening statement, and then I'll introduce our witnesses. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. The topic of social capital is an important one, especially when it is used to build communities up. And I worry, though, that this conversation can be used to blame disadvantaged communities for not already being successful. It's easy to generalize about people and communities, but I believe we must resist doing that. Because otherwise Congress, instead of building communities up, risks institutionalizing stereotypes and discrimination. It is offensive and frankly not constructive to blame communities for the challenges that they face today. Blame is no substitute for a strong economic foundation and smart investments in our children and our workers. Social networks help, but investments in individuals and communities are key to building a better future and a more vibrant economy. I think we'd all agree that Congress cannot and should not force people to marry, become friends with their neighbors, or even join civic organizations or churches. We need to be both strategic and realistic about the policies that we pursue. When I was a child, both of my parents worked. For my father, his union job helped him to earn a higher wage, to earn protections at work, and belonging to a union is a source of social capital, and my family benefited from that. I benefited from that. My mother, on the other hand, didn't have a union job, and at one point her factory schedule was 3 weeks on, 1 day off, plus overtime nearly every day, for a wage that undervalued her work and undervalued her, leaving her with little time to spend building those networks. So as we prepare to hear about the role of social capital, about ways to help working families get into the middle class, to even have the time to make community connections and shore up social capital, it's important that we not lose sight of investing in people like my mother. Right now, the deck is stacked against some and in favor of others. Children of wealthier parents start with a leg up. Good schools are increasingly concentrated in high-income areas, leaving millions of our children behind. While a college education has long been thought of as the path to the American dream, that path is financially out of reach for far too many Americans. As Americans, we have a deep commitment to everyone getting a fair shot. To achieve that, government has a significant role to play. It must provide the essential building blocks, affordable child care and pre-K, quality K-12 education, comprehensive health care, and access to affordable post-secondary education. We can break the cycle of poverty by simultaneously providing programs and supports to parents and their children. The two-generation approach is evidence-based, it's data-driven, bipartisan policy with a history that works. I've seen the power of two-gen models in New Mexico with initiatives like the United Way's Early Learning Center in Santa Fe, which offers year-round, full-day services for children right next to technology, employment, and social service assistance for parents under one roof. Helping parents and children in these programs develop supportive networks is an important component of helping these families achieve success and building stronger communities. We must expand proven programs like the EITC and the Child Tax Credit that lift almost 10 million people out of poverty each year. We need universal pre-K starting at age 3. We have long known that investments in early education boost education outcomes and increase earnings. Government cannot and should not go it alone. In Gallup, in Carlsbad, Silver City, and throughout New Mexico, it is the schools, the churches, the nonprofits, the businesses, the philanthropic groups that define the community. They are the community anchors, but government must provide the basics. Professor Small's research on Head Start attendance reminds us that limited, inexpensive interventions can have deeply meaningful impacts. His research found that when parents of Head Start students developed networks, attendance improved. Just one example, but we can learn two important things from this research. First, that social networks can strengthen an already effective program, and second, that without that government program, we wouldn't have the foundation on which to build. I look forward to your testimony.
Thank you, Senator Heinrich. Now I'd like to introduce each of our witnesses. Dr. Robert Putnam is the Peter and Isabel Malkin Professor of Public Policy at Harvard University. He is also a member of the National Academy of Sciences and the British Academy, and a past president of the American Political Science Association. He has received a number of scholarly honors and has written 14 books, including Bullying Alone and his latest book, Our Kids, The American Dream in Crisis. Dr. Putnam graduated from Swarthmore College, where he won a Fulbright Fellowship to study at Balliol College, Oxford, and earned master's and doctorate degrees from Yale University. Dr. Charles Murray is the W.H. Brady Scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. He's written a number of books, including Coming Apart, and his most recent, By the People, Rebuilding Liberty Without Permission. His first book, Losing Ground, has been credited as the intellectual foundation for the Welfare Reform Act of 1996. Dr. Murray holds a PhD in political science from Massachusetts Institute of Technology and a bachelor's degree in history from Harvard University. Dr. Yuval Levin is the Hertog Fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center and a contributing editor to National Review and the Weekly Standard. He's the founding editor of National Affairs, a quarterly journal on domestic policy and politics. He served on the White House domestic policy staff under President George W. Bush and was also a congressional staffer. He's the author of a number of books, including The Great Debate, Edmund Burke, Thomas Paine, and The Birth of Right and Left, and most recently, The Fractured Republic, Renewing America's Social Contract in the Age of Individualism. He earned a bachelor's degree in political science at American University and holds a PhD from the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago. Dr. Mario Small is the Grafstein Family Professor of Sociology at Harvard University. He's authored a number of award-winning books, including Via Victoria, The Transformation of Social Capital in a Boston Barrio, and Unanticipated Gains, Origins of Network Inequality in Everyday Life. He's also an author of numerous articles on urban poverty and support networks, and he's currently writing a book on how people decide to whom to turn for social support. Dr. Small holds a bachelor's degree in sociology and anthropology from Carleton College and a master's and doctorate from Harvard University. Thank you all for your willingness to be here today to testify. And with that, I'd like to turn to Dr. Putnam for testimony, to be followed by Dr. Levin, to be followed rather by Dr. Murray, Dr. Levin, and Dr. Small. Dr. Putnam.
Thank you. Vice Chairman Lee, Senator Heinrich, members, I welcome this opportunity to discuss the topic of social capital with you, as I have done in recent years with grassroots groups in virtually every district and virtually every state represented in this entire committee. I'm sorry that there aren't everybody here, because I'd like to talk with them about their home districts. I've visited them and talked with people in their home districts about these issues of social capital. Policymakers often focus on hard economic factors, ignoring softer social factors. In the last 25 years, scholars have collected hard evidence on these softer factors under the rubric of social capital, making this one of the fastest growing areas in social science. The literature is reviewed in the excellent staff report, so I can be succinct. Social capital refers to social networks and the associated norms of trustworthiness and reciprocity. We all intuitively recognize the importance of social capital because we are all immersed every day in many such networks. Our families, friends, neighbors, work colleagues, folks from church, folks from the bowling league, even someone you met last night while celebrating the Celtics' victory. Scholars have learned in recent decades just how deeply such networks influence our health, our happiness, prosperity, the safety of our streets, the productivity of our firms, the performance of our schools, and even the quality of our democracy. To illustrate the importance of social capital, I want to focus briefly on two policy issues. The first, rooted in the early stages of life, the growing opportunity gap between rich kids and poor kids in America, and the second, an unnoticed problem that will arise when the bowling alone generation becomes the aging alone generation. First, the opportunity gap. As I described in my book, our kids the last several decades have witnessed a growing gap between rich kids and poor kids in the resources and the opportunities they have for upward mobility and personal success. In a perfect social storm, the opportunity gap causes, including, as Charles Murray has pointed out, growing economic inequality, increasing class segregation, and the collapse of the working class family. Social capital contributes to the opportunity gap. For example, families in the lower third of the population of all races and ethnic groups, in that part of the society, the families are increasingly fractured and fragile, as illustrated in J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy. Scholars from various sides of the political divide disagree about exactly why this has happened, the collapse of the working class family, but all sides now agree that fragile families are bad for kids. Poor kids are also isolated from community life, from neighbors, clergy, civic associations, and even extracurricular activities like sports and music. This extracurricular gap, in turn, contributes to a gap in mentors, like coaches, and in soft skills, like teamwork and grit, and even, eventually, differences in lifetime income, attributable to this extracurricular gap. This class gap in football and band and so on is new to our history, and the explanation is simple and yet shocking: pay to play. When cost-cutting school boards, in response to our pressure as voters, began charging parents hundreds of dollars a year for a kid to play sports, it is no surprise that poor kids dropped out. In short, ignoring social capital has led directly to the opportunity gap. My second example is this: bowling alone is leading to aging alone, and that matters a lot. Providing care for aging Americans is a growing challenge. We all recognize the massive number of baby boomers now retiring, but few understand that per person, boomers will enjoy much less informal elder care than their parents did. Many aging Americans now rely on paid elder care, like nursing homes and home health care aides, but an estimated 3/4 of all care for Americans over 65 is provided by family, friends, neighbors, and civic organizations. Crucially, however, that statistic, 3/4 of all care, is based on the experience of the greatest generation, a now vanishing cohort that had very high levels of social capital. By contrast, boomers are now entering their sunset years with much less social capital. Compared to the previous generation, as the previous generation approached retirement, boomers have roughly 12% fewer spouses, 36% fewer children, 30% fewer close friends, and 40% fewer religious and community ties of the sort that the chairman referred to. Sorry, Vice Chairman. In round numbers, in short, boomers are entering retirement with 1/3 less social capital than their parents enjoyed. And that's not an academic matter. Social isolation is a strong predictor of morbidity and mortality, especially among the elderly. Less recognized is that lower social capital among boomers compared to their parents will make it harder for boomers to count on informal care as they age. Consequently, the need for paid elder care will rise sharply above current expectations, not simply because there are more boomers, but because fewer of them will be able to rely on informal care. Over the coming decades, paid elder care per boomer will, on average, have to double as compared with the previous generation. Now, I know this is a policy discussion, one could imagine progressive or conservative approaches to this problem, or a combination of both, but the problem itself will not vanish. This threat to our nation's health, both fiscal and physical, stems directly from the bowling alone in the 1970s, which will lead to aging alone in the 2020s. As with many other public institutions, including the opportunity gap, social capital is an underappreciated dimension of this problem. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Dr. Murray.
I welcome the chance to testify before the committee. And especially, I welcome the chance to emphasize something in this polarized age. The staff of the committee produced a report that I think Professor Putnam and I both agree is a really terrific report. Professor Putnam and I are on very different points of the ideological spectrum. I consider him to be the world's greatest authority on social capital, and whereas we have some differences in policy recommendations, the differences are overwhelmed by the ways in which we agree. I think that's heartening, and I hope that we can take advantage of that in dealing with this problem. In terms of what I can add to the discussion today, I've decided to try to focus on some of the ways in which this problem is so complicated, because I think that when we talk about statistics like the falling marriage rate or the rising dropout from the labor force by males, that it lends itself to, well, the solution is we need higher working class wages so that it's easier for people to get married, or we need more job opportunities and guys will come back into the labor force. I'm not saying that such solutions would have no good effects. I think they would. But the actual ways and the actual problems reach deeply into the ways that humans are socialized into institutions such as marriage and the labor force. And a good way to get a grip on those actual problems is our kids. Bob Putnam's book that I think is just terrific, as I have said in print. It is at the heart of that book And the reason I urge the members of the committee to read it are these wonderful, beautifully told and beautifully researched stories of real people and real families. And what I admire most about the way these are told is the narratives have not been sanitized to make them easy to deal with. We hear the voices of the unemployed whose manufacturing jobs were exported abroad. That is a real problem. And the voices of people who quit good jobs because they didn't feel like working, or who got fired because they showed up late, shirked their tasks, and got in fights with coworkers. Another real problem. We hear stories of unmarried low-income parents who are fiercely devoted to their kids, and of other parents who created children casually and walked away from them casually. If I had to pick one theme threaded throughout all of these stories, it is the many ways in which people behaved impulsively, but were oblivious to what would happen to them if they made the wrong step. This theme also appears in Steroids, in J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy. In many ways, he describes a life history which was full of opportunity, prodigiously squandered opportunities. You read Vance's account and keep saying to yourself, why are they behaving so destructively? I respect Mr. Heinrich's caution that we must not blame people for things beyond their control. It is also true that the real stories of real people and real communities get very messy in these kinds of ways. It comes down to the age-old problem of getting people, especially young people, not to do things that are attractive in the short term but disastrous in the long term, and conversely, get them to do things that aren't fun right now but that will open up rewards later in life. This is not a problem confined to any one socioeconomic class. The mental disorder known as adolescence afflicts rich and poor alike. And adolescence can extend a long time after people have left their teens. The most common way that the fortunate among us manage to get our priorities straight, and by fortunate among us, I'm not really talking about money, is by being cocooned in the institutions that are the primary resources for generating social capital, a family consisting of married parents and active membership in a faith tradition. I did not choose that phrasing lightly, even though I realize it pushes buttons. I am not implying that single women are incapable of filling this function. Millions of them are heroically trying to do so as we speak, nor that children cannot grow up successfully if they don't go to church. With regard to families, I am making an empirical statement. As a matter of statistical tendencies, biological children of married parents do much better on a wide variety of life outcomes than children growing up in any other family structure, even after controlling for income, parental education, and ethnicity. And they do so, I would argue, because of the ways in which they keep adolescents from doing destructive things. With regard to religion, I am making an assertion about a resource that can lead people, adolescents and adults alike, to do the right thing even when the enticements to do the wrong thing are strong, a belief that God commands them to do the right thing. I am also using religion in terms of its role as a community of faith, another borrowing from Robert Putnam. For its active members, a church is far more than a place where they go to worship once a week. It is a form of community that socializes the children growing up in it in all sorts of informal ways, just as the family socializes children. This is not a prelude to a set of recommendations. I don't have any. I'm just trying to argue that it is not a matter of ideology, but empiricism, to include that unless the traditional family and traditional communities of faith make a comeback, the declines in social capital that are already causing so much deterioration in our civic culture will continue, and the problems will worsen. The solutions are unlikely to be political, in my view, but cultural. We need a cultural great awakening akin to past religious great awakenings. How to bring about that needed cultural great awakening? It beats the hell out of me.
Thank you. Dr. Levin.
Vice Chairman Lee, Ranking Member Heinrich, members, thank you very much for the opportunity to testify. And more than that, thank you for taking up this subject this morning. It's very encouraging to see the Joint Economic Committee turning its attention to the question of social capital, which I think is a crucial economic question. And I commend you and your staff for excellent work already evident in the report that you've just released, and for the promise that it suggests about the committee's continuing efforts on this front. In my written testimony, I suggest why I think this question of social capital or associational life has to be part of any discussion of the country's economic prospects, and especially of the challenges that are confronted by the most vulnerable Americans. In these brief remarks this morning, let me say a few words about the challenges of making this a part of our policy conversations and how I think that might be undertaken responsibly. Maybe the best thing about the report that your committee staff has produced is that it is unabashedly diagnostic. Too often, those of us who are engaged in these debates are afraid to be dismissed as political radiologists. The radiologist will look over your scans very carefully and tell you half your ribs are broken. I hope somebody can help you with that. Good luck. And move on to the next patient. And I think many of us who study this subject often feel that way. We tend to respond to that by ending our discussions of this or ending books and articles about it that offer valuable diagnosis with prescriptive conclusions that are frankly often just less valuable. The characteristic book on this subject, and I genuinely do exempt present company from that description, will offer profound and subtle analysis of what has happened to American associational life and why, and then we'll tack on some general ideas about how tweaking various social programs might make a difference at the margins. If the problems are as profound as we say, those solutions, though they can be valuable, are unlikely to cut it. And yet, if more comprehensive and radical reforms are needed, we don't have real evidence of what will work on a large scale. And in some cases, we lack evidence even of what will work on any small scale. Obviously, stopping at diagnosis is unsatisfying and insufficient, particularly for policymakers. But we do need to make sure that we start at diagnosis, and we have to make sure that we don't simply see that diagnosis as an excuse to double down on policy preferences that are not actually rooted in it. That's what happens a lot of the time, I'm afraid. Our social policy debates between the left and the right today usually amount to arguments about whether we should do more or less of what we're already doing. The left wants more and calls for increasing our investment in the model of social policy that we have, generally speaking, the model built up around the Great Society. The right wants less and argues for pulling back on those investments and letting other actors fill the space. And evidence about social capital is generally just stuffed into these boxes so that some progressives will say that stronger associational lives are only possible when basic material wants are met, which is certainly true, and that it isn't happening sufficiently for too many Americans. So the evidence about social capital supports the case for greater investment in the existing safety net, or the case that inequality is the root of our problems. Some conservatives will say that our social programs sometimes actively undermine our associational lives and the amassing of social capital by substituting for work and family and community rather than reinforcing them, or by undermining personal responsibility. These sets of arguments are both correct up to a point, but neither is sufficient. The evidence regarding social capital can support both views, but I think it actually gestures toward a rather different view. It's true, of course, that meeting basic material needs is essential and that our society has an obligation to help those who need help doing that. But it should be clear by now that this alone will not address the deep social dysfunction that results from the loss of social capital in American life. It's also true that there are ways in which our social policy contributes to that loss of social capital, but that doesn't mean that rolling back that policy will reverse the loss. And more importantly, it doesn't mean that the past half-century of social policy has been a failure. The war on poverty has not failed. It has dramatically reduced extreme poverty in America, and it would be a perverse reading of the evidence on social capital to suggest that we should undo that important progress against poverty. But what the evidence does suggest is that the approach we now have to social policy is not adequate to helping revive associational life in America. It does not do a good job of either building on what works or uprooting what does harm, and neither doing more nor doing less of it would by itself amount to a prescription that's responsive to the diagnosis when it comes to social capital. In part, that means that we should accept that public policy in general isn't going to solve the problems of associational life in America. It could do more to help, it could do less to hurt, but it won't be the core of the solution. But that can't be all that we say. We have to also think about how policy might help more and hurt less. And that requires us to look beyond the familiar model of our social programs and think about what genuinely different approaches might look like. We need an approach to social policy that is rooted from the start in some understanding of the problem of social capital. And we don't have that approach, which means that we will need to seek it by some experimentation and some period of learning. To me, for one thing, that points in the direction of empowering local institutions to attempt different approaches to our foremost social problems as they present themselves in different parts of our society. That's not because we know that local works better. In some instances, it may. It's because we don't know what works, and experimentation is what you do when you don't have the answers. As my written testimony suggests, I think that this argues for some devolution of policy design and not just policy implementation in welfare and in labor policy, to a degree also in education and other arenas. And some work along these lines has been attempted over the years, of course, so we can learn from both its successes and its failures. But above all, even more than arguing for local power, all of this argues for humility, and it argues for proper diagnosis, which has to precede any attempt at using public policy on a large scale. And so it adds up to commending the work that you're beginning here, and again to thanking you for inviting me to participate this morning. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Small.
Vice Chairman Lee, Ranking Member Heinrich, and other members of the committee, I thank you for the invitation. I appreciate the opportunity to contribute to this discussion of social capital and economic opportunities. Social capital is something that nations can have and something that individuals can have. A nation's social capital is its degree of connectedness, sense of community, and civic participation. And as you've all read, there is an ongoing debate over whether these conditions have declined in the United States over the last 50 years. Today, I will focus instead on the social capital of individuals, which is the resources they have access to by virtue of their networks. These resources can be of many different kinds. There are three are especially important: information, social support, and the reinforcement of norms. To be clear, I'll use an example. Consider someone who has decided to improve his health by beginning to lift weights. This person can go it alone, but having a partner on hand will provide access to the three resources. First, information, as the partner is likely to have access to different sources of information on nutrition or lifting. Second, social support, as the partner can serve as a literal spotter to assist while pressing heavier weights. And third, in the reinforcement of norms, as the partner will be a source of motivation. You are far less likely to skip going to the gym at 6 o'clock in the morning if your partner, is going to be there waiting. These three resources will increase the odds that the new venture will succeed. The benefits suggested by this analogy are supported by the literature. For example, there is abundant evidence that the information available through networks helps people move up the economic ladder and get jobs. There's also evidence that the social support available through networks helps people avoid the worst mental and health consequences of major life stressors. Having noted these benefits, I must clarify two things. First, some commentators have used the term social capital to refer to core values such as hard work, marriage, and education. However, social capital and values are different things. Values are beliefs. Social capital is a tool. Just as the weightlifter is more likely to fail not because he lacks the values, but because he lacks the partner, so may a highly motivated person pursuing work or education have difficulty meeting her goals because she lacks the information or support or norm reinforcement that is available through social networks. Information is especially important. For example, many talented low-income students do not apply to elite colleges because they do not know that such colleges can provide grants to cover the costs of their own tuition charges. This kind of information is well known in middle-class networks and easily taken for granted, but it's often missing among lower-income kids. Second, I clarify that social capital is no panacea. Often, economic resources are necessary. Just as the lifter must be able to afford the necessary nutritional supplements and new clothing and expensive gym membership, so must low-income children have access to proper nutrition and school supplies and high-quality education to have good odds of success. Social capital alone is not enough. I will conclude my comments by focusing on the role of effective policy can have in helping people build valuable social capital. One of the best sites to do so, I believe, is early education programs, which can be mobilized to help not only children, but also their parents. Many childcare and early education programs help parents build social capital. A national survey recently found that 60% of mothers whose children were enrolled in childcare centers made at least one new friend there, and as a result, had networks of close friends more than 30% larger than those of statistically comparable mothers whose children were not in centers. These networks mattered for both mental and material hardship, for example. Low-income mothers whose children were enrolled in centers and who made friends there had 40% lower odds of depression. their material hardship scores, or the extent to which they had their utilities cut off, or went hungry for lack of food, or showed other indicators of true economic difficulty, were more than 20% lower. The promise of social capital has motivated early education centers to experiment different ways of improving their work. One randomized controlled trial managed to increase Head Start attendance by 7% in the winter months just by nudging parents into mobilizing their own social capital, thus maximizing the return on tax dollars already spent, while also helping improve school readiness among low-income children. The intervention itself, I should say, cost almost nothing. Improving and expanding early education have been topics of debate in recent years. I think thinking more expansively about the role of parents may prove valuable. Parents or children are part of a unit, and social capital is a great tool through which effective policy can provide all members of the unit true access to opportunity. I recommend that Congress explore the potential of interventions focused on social capital in contexts such as early education programs. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate each of your opening statements. We'll now begin 5-minute rounds of questioning, and I will begin with that. Then we'll alternate between Democrat and Republican members of the committee. I'd like to open by asking each of the witnesses a question, and this time we'll start with Dr. Small and move over to Dr. Putnam. You know, we're trying to use this project as an opportunity to expand Congress's horizon, to look at things that Congress tends to overlook. We have metrics that Congress is constantly looking at, things like GDP, the rate of GDP growth, the percentage of GDP coming into the federal government through the tax code and so forth. Limits on time and resources sometimes create blind spots for us as lawmakers, sometimes resulting in us not exploring, perhaps as we should, new perspectives on things like family stability, opioids, the decreased workforce participation rate, and so forth. So as the Social Capital Project develops its research agenda, what are some of the issues that you would recommend that we take a look at from our vantage point as policymakers? Paying special attention, of course, to anything that might potentially garner bipartisan support. Dr. Small? Sure.
I think it certainly makes sense if the question is what aspects of social capital should we be paying more attention to beyond the economic questions that we typically pay attention to. I think one issue is paying a great deal of attention to the things that have probably declined, but also the things that have probably increased. So there's been substantial evidence of the decrease in certain forms of social capital, as you've all seen in the report. But there have also been new forms of community connectedness and engagement that simply didn't exist 50 years ago that we now have to start measuring. The extent to which people can connect with people beyond their local communities, for example, has increased. Some forms of volunteering, for example, have also increased. Political participation beyond your local town has increased in many respects because the internet and social media make things possible that weren't possible in the past. I think one of the most important things to do if we're interested in collecting believable evidence on these questions is to make sure that the nostalgia we all tend to face for certain kinds of things doesn't cloud the chance of looking at the new ways in which young people are finding ways of creating social capital. I think that's going to be an important part of the conversation. The second thing I think is also going to be an important part of it is looking not just at collective measures of social capital and just at measures that tell us what the country as a whole is doing or how the country as a whole has changed, but also the extent to which there are differences among individuals, among people of different class groups or different racial groups, for example, different genders, in the extent to which they have access to the kinds of opportunities that social capital may provide. So I think that would be the second set of issues I would look at, heterogeneity within the country as opposed to only trends within the country as a whole.
Thank you. Dr. Levin?
Thank you for the question, and I would really very much second what Dr. Small has said in a number of ways. I think, first of all, this kind of project has to engage in some kind of sociology of success. That is, thinking about what works, especially amid circumstances where so much is failing. So in communities where there are profound problems, the question of how the exceptions happen, what drives them, what makes them possible, is a very important question to explore and to think about, both because it's simply not the case that people simply live with failure. People respond to failure, And I think we in Washington are not very good at seeing the ways in which a statistical disaster is actually also home to some examples of human thriving that we need to learn from. And the ability that people have to thrive amid circumstances where social capital is absent is going to help us learn how to help other people succeed. Secondly, I also think that the sheer diversity of the challenges people face means that policymakers in Washington have to think about how to empower Americans to help each other. We obviously have to think also about how to use public policy to help individuals in difficult circumstances. But part of what it would mean to think about social capital as both a target and a means, both an end and a means, is to look for ways in which public policy can help people help one another by empowering community institutions through which people help each other, and seeing that those institutions are not just ways of delivering benefits, they're also ways of creating culture. And ultimately what you find is that in the areas of life where people aren't able to make decisions that are constructive for themselves, they change those habits because the culture around them changes, or because the culture around them drives them to change. You know, I was involved when I worked in the Bush White House in an initiative to look at ways of improving marriage rates in some communities, for example. And I would say that initiative was a failure. We tried many things. We tried it in ways that produced a lot of data, and the data showed that most of what we tried did not succeed. And by most, I mean really almost everything. The few exceptions involved circumstances where people are affected not by incentives that they see out of the corners of their eyes, but by cultures in which they live fully. And obviously there's a great limit on how much government can do in that respect, but I think we should look for ways to be helpful to communities that are finding ways to help their members succeed in difficult times.
Thank you. Dr. Murray. If you hit the button so we can hear.
You've got a real problem with getting a bipartisan set of measures, because even though the scholarly end of this, there is a growing consensus. I think that when I talked about the family, the traditional family, and communities of faith as being major sources of social capital, I know very well that Bob Putnam and I could talk about this and find ourselves on the same page in virtually everything, not because ideologically we think families are great and religion is great, but in terms of the concept of social capital, these are two huge sources of it. And so if you were going to have an index of social capital, like you have an index of poverty, you'd have to have those in there. But that would mean saying, well, actually, married families are a good thing and unmarried families are a worse thing in some measurement sense with regard to social capital, and the same thing with regard to religion. That ain't going to be bipartisan no matter what you do. What Bob Putnam successfully did with Bowling Alone was to get people of a very wide divergence of views to accept that we had a problem there. But I'm going to turn it over to him right now so he can speak for himself. But he did this by having a whole lot of indicators. So he had in the book a statement that if half of all social capital is religious in origin, that's a simplification. He could say that in the book, but he could still appeal to a lot of readers because he talked about lots of other things too. So if you want somebody that will solve this problem for you, he's sitting to my left.
Dr. Putnam.
I'm not sure whether that last comment was a friendly comment or not. That is, that I'm going to solve all the problems. I would say, I'll try to be telegraphic. First, social capital is a purple concept. It encourages us to think of problems that are intelligible not just through a blue lens or not just through a red lens. It requires us to think across ideological lines. And a lot of problems in the real world are purple problems. And as I have talked to your constituents over the last 3 or 4 years, ordinary people in America understand that problems are not either neatly red or neatly blue. It requires and I'm extremely sympathetic to the initiative of this committee, but it requires a certain willingness to think in purple terms, to understand that not every problem is either just a red problem or a blue problem. Now, I want to be trying to be brief in answer to your specific question, sir. I think that that how to understand the internet, which emerged actually just after I wrote Bowling Alone, is a complicated question. And the question is, will the internet make the problem better or worse? And the answer to that question is yes. That is, it will make it both better and worse. And there's a lot of debate among experts and in the literature about the way social capital is affected by the internet. The crucial idea here, I think, is to think in terms of alloys. An alloy is a metal that's composed of two other metals, but the mixture of the two has properties different from either one. And most of all of our networks are alloys. That is to say, nobody now lives solely with face-to-face ties, and nobody now lives solely with electronic ties. And so you have to ask about what are the natures of the alloys that that is mixtures of social media and face-to-faceness. Not all the alloys are the same, but I'm urging the committee, first of all, to focus on that. Secondly, don't go into it thinking that the internet is either the solution to all of our problems, the root of all of our problems. But thirdly, to think not in those dichotomous terms, either face-to-face or electronic, but rather to think about different forms of alloys. My last point is I do think that the committee could make a major contribution in providing or in encouraging the the administration, the executive branch, to provide better measures at a local level for social capital. We do have, and I'm agreeing here, we do have good national data about these trends. That's what I draw on, that's what all of us draw on. It's much harder to be able to say, as I said before, I've talked in almost all of your individual constituencies. I've been in Peoria and in Decatur, and I've been in, I couldn't do this, I've been in actually everybody's constituency, and at those levels, there are differences in the character of social capital, but we can't talk about them in a rigorous way because we don't have good local area-based measures of social capital. That's not impossible, it's just not being done.
Thank you. Senator Heinrich.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. I'm going to yield for just a few seconds of my time to Senator Klobuchar. She has a meeting at the White House she needs to get to.
Thank you very much. Thank you, all of you. I've read your book, Professor Putnam, and enjoyed it. And thank you for being here today. Today's hearing really provides a chance to look at how to build social capital and why it's important, and look at policies about how we can do a better job, especially in this isolating time. As someone who reads their Twitter feed every so often, I'd say it can be an isolating time with people's reactions to things. But at the same time, as I know from my state of Minnesota, and Representative Paulson knows from our state, is that we build social capital every day. It is built in the church basements over a hot dish on Friday nights at a raffle to raise money for a good cause, at the Hmong Marketplace, where many in our Hmong community and others from around the Twin Cities get together to shop, or the Brian Coyle Center, where many in our Somali community, we have the biggest Somali community in the country in Minnesota, gather together, or in the spaghetti feeds on Minnesota's Iron Range. So that is how I see us still building social capital, and now more than ever, I see this isolating time of polarization, and I've actually seen more people turn out, whether it's a Jewish Community Center event or a expansion of our Dorothy Day Center in St. Paul, than I have ever seen since I've been in political office. So it is possible that people are reacting to what they hear in a good way. One troubling aspect of this hearing today, we are here to discuss a very important issue that impacts our society, and I think there are many constructive ways in which we should examine the issue of social capital, and it's our responsibility to seek a wide range of expertise. I do want to express concern that I do not believe it is constructive to engage on this matter with individuals whose theories are drastically polarizing and have been discredited. And I will leave it at that, and I will submit my questions on this point on the record. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator. I'm going to get started with my questions. I want to start with you, Dr. Small. We've heard some different theories today about why some people succeed, why others don't. Are you aware of any evidence that inherent genetic differences drive those economic outcomes?
No.
Would it be wise for Congress to make policy predicated on either gender or genetic or racial stereotypes?
No, it would be counterproductive.
Alternatively, would it be wise for Congress to focus on policies that invest in both peoples and communities, irrespective of race, religion, creed, and also irrespective of how diverse or even how remote or rural they are?
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I'm hoping we do today.
So you've done a lot of research about the benefits of investing in early childhood education, for example, Head Start. As the Congress works to invest in our nation's children, not only because it's the right thing to do, but because investing in our kids actually means investing in our collective economic future, what lessons would you hope that members of this committee would learn?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Senator. I guess I would say a couple of things. One is that we pay special attention to the evidence confirming the importance of early education, the evidence both that high-quality, well-organized early education programs work, the evidence that also, from a cost-benefit perspective, they're a wise investment, and the evidence that children in low-income communities, both in the poorest inner-city neighborhoods but also in rural parts of the country, tend to respond positively to those. The second thing I would add is that new evidence that's emerging from actually local experiments in multiple parts of the country suggests that thinking more expansively about the potential role of social capital in improving the benefits of these early education programs suggests that we could do more and more effectively by thinking a little bit more broadly about such programs. I guess the third thing I would say is that one common theme across many of these new experimental programs I have seen is the idea of no longer thinking about children and parents separately, but thinking about the family holistically. This is an issue where I found commentators on both the left and the right make a version of the same point, that if you think not just about whether you're taking care of the kid, but thinking about a child as part of a family unit with a collective, not individual set of problems, and therefore a collective rather than individual set of solutions, you're likely to get far better results, and you're likely to use make far better use of taxpayer dollars.
Thank you for bringing that up, because that's one of my other particular interests in this is the sort of two-generation approach to trying to deal with poverty. And we've seen great leadership in very diverse states, from Utah to New Mexico and others, with that approach, and we've seen real positive outcomes from it. I've certainly seen that work in a number of my communities in New Mexico. I've actually introduced some legislation with Senator Collins to try and increase opportunities and get out of those silos. And I think it may have been Dr. Levin who mentioned sort of the war on poverty and the progress that was made in the 1960s in some of these programs, but the need to recognize where we are today. And one of the things that I think the two-generation approach does is it recognizes that many of those things are in silos. And if they're in silos and you can't access them, then they're not actually supporting the family network. So we'll start with Dr. Small and go right across to Dr. Putnam, because I know he has an interest in this as well. What are your thoughts on the two-generation approach and its potential for sort of weaving these two things together of basic foundational support along with the importance of social capital? Let's start with Dr. Putnam, and then we'll come back to the left.
I can answer briefly. I think it's terrific. I think for all the reasons, I think it's a terrific idea. I think for all the reasons that you alluded to, treating just the needs of a child, that's important. Of course that's important. But thinking of the child as part of a family unit and therefore providing coaching and all around, what's often called in the field wraparound support for the family, is the evidence says that's synergistic. You get more out of the combining early childhood education and family support than you would get out of either of those taken separately.
Dr. Murray, do you have?
I'm not familiar with the literature on the two-family support work, so I'm really not competent to respond.
Okay. Dr. Levin?
I think it's an important innovation in thinking about public policy to understand that one of the problems we've had in social policy in America is that it has been overly individualistic in how it thinks about people in need. That it's tended to isolate individuals even within a family, let alone within a community, and approach them as needing resources on their own. The fact is, we are all dependent on one another, and I think any approach to social policy that recognizes that and that helps people help people who are dependent on them, that is, be responsible, while also helping them meet needs, is an improvement. I would say that it's important not to force a model from the federal level all the way down to the local level, to be supportive of different approaches, including this kind of approach, but not to assume that one size is going to fit all in a country that's as vast as ours.
Dr. Small, do you have anything to add?
Largely that I would agree. I think the point that philosophically it's difficult to tell people to worry more about family, but to create programs that only target their kids, so the parents actually doesn't make a lot of sense. I think also from a practical perspective, what we have is a situation where there are out there very strongly skilled professionals who are specialists on children, or who are specialists on parents and workforce development or early education, and therefore they do what they do best. I think in the absence of an outside intervention of the kind you're describing, where there's an incentive for these different kinds of specialists to think about the family as a unit, it'll be difficult for them to be naturally inclined to do so. So I actually find with the idea that you're proposing to be very promising, both from a philosophical but also from a practical perspective.
Thank you. Dr. Putnam, you've talked extensively about how weaker social networks among baby boomers could make their care dramatically more expensive as they age. And, you know, I've seen in my own family the importance of the interaction between being able to access health care, be it through the VA, private insurance, or Medicare, and then being able to have the social connections and the support that make life valuable. Would cutting health care coverage, for example, you know, we saw a bill emerge from the House in the last few weeks that cuts Medicaid by, I think, $800 billion, if I have my figures correct. How does that make those social support challenges either more or less acute?
Thank you for that. Thank you for that question. I first of all have to say I'm not a gerontologist, so this is not a field that unlike some of the other stuff where I'm willing to present myself as an expert. Gotcha. My work in this area is based on just looking at the implications for gerontology of what we already know, namely that baby boomers at every stage of their life have had just much less connection. I think here I think the policy options that flow from this are pretty clear, and I don't need much explanation for me. I mean, we're going to have to spend a lot more money than we currently realize on caring for aging baby boomers, not just because there are a lot of them, but because they don't have the social support that the greatest generation, their predecessors, had. Whether that comes from public sources, Medicaid, I mean, and Medicare, but Medicaid is the relevant portion because that's supporting the nursing home, the long-term care, or through private sources. That's a debate that both sides of this committee are familiar with that debate, and I don't have anything particularly to add to it except to say the problem is real, so it's not going to go away. I think that's all I can add to the conversation.
I'm going to yield back the rest of my time so we can get to some of the other members.
Thank you. Representative LaHood.
Thank you, Vice Chair Lee, for having this hearing, and I want to thank the witnesses today for your valuable testimony and for being here. There's really two statistics that jump out when I look at the materials today. One is the statistic that shows between 1970 and 2016, the share of children in America raised by a single parent or by neither parent rose from 15% to 31%. So doubled. And then the second one is between 1970 and 2015, births to single mothers rose from 11% of all births to 40% of all births. And in looking at both of those statistics and the societal effects and the costs that it has on our country, and I think about that in a number of ways, and I think it affects rural as well as urban. I spent 10 years as a state and federal prosecutor, and in that role as a prosecutor, before every sentencing, we get a pre-sentence report that details the defendant that we're going to sentence. And 95% of them read the same when it comes to early childhood or background. Born into a single-family home, didn't have any of that upbringing that we are used to in a conventional family upbringing, and wound up early getting involved with the criminal justice system, drugs, alcohol, and led to further crimes in the system. And I think about the societal costs of these stark statistics, public education system, particularly in our urban areas, how much money we throw at to increase graduation rates and dropout rates. Not only the court system, but our jails and prisons, and how they are full of kids in some ways and adults that are affected by a single family upbringing or no parent. And then, of course, healthcare costs, which we don't talk enough about, but mental illness, behavioral health that we have to pay money for, and drug and alcohol rehabilitation, and then, of course, our welfare system and how it drains on that. And as I listen to the testimony here today on what are the remedies, what, from a public policy standpoint, can we look at to help stem this tide? And it's difficult to find real success stories. And I know, Dr. Putnam, you talked about being a purple issue. Dr. Levin, you talked about trying to increase marriage rates, and that was a failure, and trying to have more community input. But I guess from a public policy standpoint, sometimes throwing more money at it perpetuates the problems in many ways. And so trying to figure out, is there success stories that each of you can point to that have worked in specific areas? And is the trajectory changing as we move on, or is it going to continue? And I'll start with Dr. Levin.
Well, thank you for the question. It's a vitally important question. I would say a couple of things. First of all, there are stories to tell about genuinely significant reversals in dangerous social trends. I think the example of teen pregnancy over the past 15 years is an underappreciated and understudied example of a genuinely disastrous cultural trend genuinely turning around in a meaningful way. I would not say, sitting here, that I can give you an exact description of why and how that happened, but it certainly included some combination of bipartisan agreement about the existence of the problem, of frank discussion of ways of addressing it, ways of taking it on that made both sides of our politics uncomfortable, and ultimately a culture change that made a big difference. Now, I don't think that there is in that a model for dramatically changing rates of family formation that could have the same kind of effect. But I think that, again, place by place, community by community, there may be something to learn there. I would also say, and this is a challenging point to make in a way that doesn't diminish the significance of the problem. If you had told an American in 1950 that the rates of out-of-wedlock births would rise from about 5% that year to almost 50% in 2017, and asked that person what our country would look like as a result, they would describe a country that looks much worse than our country. They would have described a hellscape that we would not recognize. The fact is, we have dealt with this problem in ways that can help us think about what success can look like. I don't think it's possible to return to the family formation rates of the 1950s. Those were very unusual. It's not the case that that's how things always were in America until the 1960s. It was a very unusual moment in post-war America, and it's a moment that we should be careful about using as a standard and a norm in all of our cultural discussions. People have found ways of thriving despite enormous disadvantages, including being born into broken families, which is an enormous disadvantage. I think we have a profound obligation to try to help people build stronger families for their children and to try to help children grow up in stronger families. We also have an obligation to deal with the reality that a lot of Americans will not grow up in intact families, and to try to find ways of allowing them to thrive nonetheless. That's not to offer solutions, right? That's an answer in search of a final sentence that resolves the problem. But I do think that we need to think realistically about what problems we're looking for solutions to, and to define that in as broad a way as we reasonably can in public policy.
Thank you. Dr. Murray?
Well, you asked specifically about marriage rates and out-of-wedlock birth rates and turning those around. Are there any success stories? I am not familiar with any. Also, one has to recognize the degree to which this is a class-based phenomenon, that marriage rates for those in the upper middle class are still very high. They stopped declining in the 1980s. Divorce has gone down for the upper middle class since then. Marriage is alive and well in the upper middle class, and it's the bottom has fallen out of it in the working class. And the statistics I used in Coming Apart, I focus specifically on non-Latino whites for a very clear reason. I don't want people to be under any illusion this is related to ethnicity. This is an American social problem. And at the time I was looking at those numbers, the ones for 2010 were that among white working class folks, that you had 48% married, down from the more than 80% in 1960. It's been essentially a collapse. And if you go to white working class communities, or I'm sure black working class communities or Latino ones, I do not know of any examples where marriage rates have risen. And if others on the panel have, I'd love to hear it.
Thank you. Dr. Putnam?
Actually, I agree with the preceding two speakers. The statistics you quoted are, of course, right. The one you probably meant to include but didn't is this one about class differences, the growth in out-of-wedlock births and the growth of fractured and fragile families is entirely concentrated in the working class. And that only makes the problem worse, because it means that kids from one side of the tracks are not getting the same support at home. There's a surprising amount of consensus, actually, among experts here. There wouldn't have been 10, 15 years ago, but there now is. And I think there's consensus on the following points. One, this is happening. That is, there's a growing class gap in family formation. Two, it's important. It does matter for the kids. Three, everybody recognizes that there are single moms who are doing a bang-up job against big challenges, so it's not a matter of blaming the moms, but nevertheless it is a problem. Four, the change probably has been driven by a combination of cultural and economic factors. That is to say, you ask me, I'm mostly on the left. I think there's a big cultural change that's happened, but I also think there have been big economic changes that have happened. And I think if we frame this as if we have to choose between why has this happened, is it really economics or is it really culture, that's going to get in our way of trying to fix it. And last point, I think we agree that we can think of things on the economic side that might make a difference. That is, providing EITC or there are other ways in which you could provide greater economic support to families in this situation. But we also, I think there's broad agreement with what Yuval said, that is that even though there are clear cultural causes of this, we don't know how to turn that dial, except with respect to the teen pregnancy issue. It's important that we understand this. The teen pregnancy problem is back, as I don't want to say it's solved, but there's been a huge decline in teen pregnancy at the very same time that there's been a growth in out-of-wedlock births. How could that happen? Because most of these out-of-wedlock births are not happening to teenagers. They're happening to couples in their 20s and 30s. And exactly how you begin to address that is, honestly, the cultural side of that is not so clear to me. I mean, I think it would be great if we could figure out how to do that, but I do not know of any success stories at that level. And I think that's actually what I've said most experts in this field would agree with what I've just said, I think.
Representative Maloney.
Thank you. And Dr. Putnam, thank you for your books. Mr. Chairman, let me begin with a few thoughts on this hearing. Dr. Murray has rather infamously written, and I quote, "No woman has been a significant original thinker in any of the world's great philosophical traditions," end quote. Let's think about that for a moment. It's not only grossly unfair, it's demonstrably untrue. From Hypatia, the great Greek mathematician, astronomer, and philosopher, who was the head of the Neoplatonic school during the Byzantine Empire, to Maria Mitchell, the first woman to discover a comet, to Grace Hopper, who wrote COBOL, one of the first computer programming languages, to the now famous mathematicians from the Academy Award-winning nominated movie, Hidden Figures, who helped America win the space race, Katherine Johnson, Dorothy Vaughan, and Mary Jackson, to Maria Mayer, who won the Nobel Prize in Physics, and Speaker Ryan's all-time favorite philosopher, Anne Ryan. These are just some of the lucky few, the women who defied the odds and the structural barriers to succeed in philosophy and science. Just think about how many more could have joined their ranks. Women solve problems, cure diseases, and invent the next great thing over and over again. Yet we must continually combat the stereotypes in Dr. Murray's work. Offensive views about a woman's capabilities are wrong-headed and hold women back from their full potential. These ideas keep women out of STEM fields in schools, out of executive positions at work, out of the boardroom, and out of Congress. We even see them in presidential politics, when one candidate claimed that a woman did not have, quote, the stamina, end quote, for the presidency. These biases are a crutch and excuse to not address the real barriers women face in our economy, underinvestment in childcare, the lack of any paid parental leave, unequal pay, and so on and so on. In my humble opinion, Congress should not give these ideas a platform, and our committee should not seek to elevate offensive claims that rely on spurious evidence. I would like to ask Dr. Small and Dr. Levin, we like to think about America on the cutting edge, but our policies hold back today's working families in so many ways. New parents are not guaranteed working families paid leave for the birth of the child. We're among 2 nations in the world that do not provide this safety net guaranteed to our families. Many of eligible young people cannot access Head Start. Our Family and Medical Leave Act, a very important bill, but it should include other important family challenges, such as conferences with teachers on a child's performance in school. And millions of low-wage workers don't have a predictable schedule. They can't even count on knowing when they're going to be working even a few days ahead of time. A situation that Senator Heinrich pointed out was a challenge his own mother confronted. So Dr. Small, how would addressing these policies, these are concrete policies that we could address, how could addressing these shortcomings enable America's working families to build a better, stronger social capital and social network?
Congresswoman, thank you for the question. It actually provides a great opportunity to connect the prior conversation to this one. I'd like to make an important observation about the rise in the rate of births to unmarried mothers, which is that it's not so much the case that working-class parents are driving the trend, it's that upper middle-class parents are the exception. In other words, it's really only among upper middle class parents where this trend has not risen. In fact, to put this in perspective, you might remember that in the 1960s, the old Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan put out a report on the Negro family, a case of national action, it was titled. And he pointed out that among African Americans, births to unmarried mothers were extremely high. Well, today, births among middle-class whites are higher than they were to to African Americans at the time Moynihan was writing. It's a trend that's happened across the board. Again, not upper middle class, but they're not just upper middle class and working class people. There are lots of middle class people out there. And among the middle class, the trends are high, and they're higher than they were when Moynihan sounded the alarm. What this tells us is not that this is not an issue, but that the core problem was the lack of resources to manage having given birth as an unmarried mother rather than just giving birth as an unmarried mother, because many middle-class parents who are doing so today seem to be doing fine. In that context, I think the point you've made about the importance of opportunities for those mothers is essential. We are unique among developing countries in the paucity of resources and opportunities we give to mothers early and shortly after, during and shortly after the birth of their children to participate fully in the economic system. This includes insufficient opportunities for paid leave, also insufficient support for full-time early education for their children, and also not fully effective or efficient enforcement of anti-discrimination legislation. I think if you saw support for both of these three things, you would find that those families who choose to do what increasingly everyone is doing will find that their mothers participate as fully in the economic system as their inherent abilities would naturally, and in many other countries, provide them the opportunity to do so.
Okay, thank you.
Senator Cotton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for convening this very important hearing, and thank you to our extremely distinguished panel of witnesses for appearing today and for all the important work you've done over the years. I'd like to start with Dr. Putnam and your written testimony. On page 5, you write, "This cherished American dream is evaporating for over 25 million children born to low-income, less educated parents in the last 3 decades." A little bit later, you write, "Rich kids and poor kids are now growing up in separate and unequal Americas." That's the case across racial and ethnic lines, correct, Dr. Putnam?
Yes, sir.
And you tell a story that I've seen with different names on it that most of us have, very poignant, about Alyssa and Layla. Alyssa, a rich kid in Southern California whose parents can afford a fancy private school and swimming lessons to get her into a better college, and Layla, whose mother is out of work and who has to work at an entry-level job and go to a for-profit college hoping that she can get ahead. Those disparities that that you write about, I think we've all seen back home in our hometowns and states with depressing regularity. You go on page 6 to say further, "Rich kids enter kindergarten almost a full year ahead of bottom third kids, and rich kids increasingly attend schools with other rich kids and poor kids with other poor kids." You have what you call scissor graphs on page 7 and page 8, which also tell the tale of the amount of time that richer parents, better educated parents, are able to spend time with their children and developmental time in what you call enrichment experiences like swimming lessons or summer camps, time just spent together at family dinners and then extracurricular activities. I want to explore that further with the chart that we have here, and I'll orient the audience to that chart. This is real hourly wages by education. So over here, you start at 1973, it's normalized to 100, where everybody's basically the same. And then you see over time coming out to just after 2003, so this doesn't include continued disparities, the growth in wages or decline based on education. And you see a very strong correlation. Those with the most advanced degrees have seen the highest wage growth, college degrees nearly as high. But then here, some college but not a degree, barely any growth at all, high school graduation, a decline, less than high school education, a collapse in wages. Does this reflect what you write about in your written testimony, Dr. Putnam? Is this one of the driving causes of the decline in social capital and social trust among more stressed families and stressed communities?
Yes, sir. It's not the only cause, but it's an important background factor. Okay. And then, if I can add,
yes, please.
What the work that I summarized in my testimony that I wrote about in Our Kids suggests is the translation of that graph into the scissors graphs in individual families means that increasingly family status is inherited, is passed from generation increasingly. And that makes it even worse.
And is that because, in part, divisions along educational and class-based lines become more self-reinforcing and perpetuating than older ethnic or racial divisions did in the mid-20th century?
Yes, sir.
You write a little bit further in testimony on page 10 about areas of interest that were left aside. Successful economic and job development policies in communities are likely to have important positive facts on the local opportunity gap, but assessing such strategies was outside the scope of our expertise. So the point there would be finding some way for people who have less than a college degree to once again partake in the American dream that increasingly is out of touch for them.
Yes, sir. Can I add just two quick qualifications? One is I used quickly rich and poor, but I was not comparing Bill Gates's kids to homeless kids. I was comparing kids coming from the upper third of American society, that is, kids coming from college-educated homes. My grandchildren are, in that sense, rich kids, although they're not rich. And I wasn't comparing them to the poorest of the poor. I'm comparing them to what we used to call the working class, that is, people who didn't get past high school. So I don't want to, I know you understand this, but I don't want the quick terms rich and poor to get misunderstood. We're talking about a basic...
I come from Dardanelle, Arkansas, where $18,000 makes you a millionaire.
Yeah.
So.
Secondly, the passage of my testimony that a written testimony that you referred to, came from a report that I chaired that was produced by 50 experts from across disciplines and across party lines and so on, that tried to figure out how can we begin to narrow the opportunity gap. And I have no doubt that local economic development strategies of the sort that you all explored in your previous hearing a month ago are important. I also think, however, and we didn't talk about those here, but we did talk about a lot of ways in which individual kids coming from disadvantaged backgrounds could be helped to get back onto what we call on-ramps, things like apprenticeship programs and community college reforms and so on that would enable poor kids coming from the bottom part of that graph themselves to move up the ladder. That blockage, increasing blockage of circulation upward is, I think, a really grave problem for America.
Thank you very much for the answers in the testimony, Dr. Putnam, and I apologize to other witnesses. My time expired, but I do want to, Chart, please, just conclude by saying, to me, one of the most important policy challenges we face as a Congress is to help find a way to increase the wages of people in our country who don't have college degrees or don't have advanced degrees. I would submit one of the easiest policy levers that we have is our immigration policy, to reorient our immigration policy towards supporting higher skilled workers as opposed to the current policy, which is heavily skewed towards unskilled or lower skilled workers, which directly competes with the workers in this area here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Representative Byer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank all of you for coming to be with us today. Yeah, as we engage in a conversation on social capital, I believe it's important that we remember that racism in our society is still very real. Just this weekend, alt-right leader Richard Spencer, whose headquarters is right down the street from my house, led 2 white supremacist rallies, one by torchlight in Charlottesville, Virginia, my own Commonwealth. The United States Congress itself has a long and ugly history on matters of race and gender. We're reminded of this every day as we walk by past statues of bygone bigots and misogynists. It's also worth remembering that those racist luminaries whose views and policies would ideally be rejected by all 535 members of Congress often turn to pseudoscience to justify hatred and exploitation. Cognizant of this history, we would hope that we would do everything in our power to make a clean break with that foul part of our legacy, as opposed to dressing it up in new clothes and returning it to these marble halls. Vice Chairman Lee, I'm fascinated by the stated topic of this hearing today, and I found your past comments on social capital very valuable. And I sincerely look forward to discussing this issue in depth with Dr. Small, Dr. Levin, Dr. Putnam. But I'm dismayed that instead of creating a forum for the discussion of critical economic issues in the best traditions of this committee, the decision to invite Charles Murray risks turning this hearing into a sideshow. I cannot imagine, Senator, a man of your intelligence and political acumen was unaware of the meaning and consequences of inviting Charles Murray. I'll note that it seems no accident that Chairman Tiberi has taken the unorthodox step of abdicating this hearing to you, and that many of your Republican colleagues have chosen to avoid this hearing altogether. I'm aware that arguments about free speech are often offered when defending invitations made to Dr. Murray. But I want to be clear, this has nothing to do with the First Amendment. The Constitution guarantees his right to write and say and publish whatever he wishes. But there's no constitutional right to testify before a congressional committee. And I don't believe that this committee's time and resources should be used to burnish his reputation. After all, it was his unconstrained exercise of his constitutionally protected right of free speech that gave him his toxic reputation in the first place. Dr. Small, I found your testimony and your scholarship interesting. I hope we have time to discuss it later in future depth, but I think we have to address the elephant of bigotry in the room. Can you give me your professional opinion of the bell curve as a matter of scholarship?
It's not a very good book. There are many reasons I could offer. I don't know how much time you have, Congressman. If you'd like a longer answer, I'm happy to provide it.
Well, let me phrase it a little differently. What's your opinion of the utility of a book that argues that African Americans are born with a lower IQ than white Americans, that there's a racially based genetic difference in IQ? Can this really be a guide for policymakers?
Not a very effective one, no.
Well, let me move on then. Dr. Putnam, I'm in the heart of the baby boom, and at least the culture I was raised in, which was pretty mixed, like the one that you write about in your book, your most recent book. But we all went to church, we were all in the Boy Scouts, Little League, summer camp, dinner together at 6 o'clock. How come we don't have any friends? And why do we have fewer friends and fewer spouses and fewer children? Not the kids that are 25 and 30, but the ones that are 55 and 65.
Thank you for that question. I spent a lot of time in the book Bowling Alone, which was written now 20 years ago, trying to understand exactly why this had happened. And I teased out a variety of things that contributed to that, things that had been happening, were happening in the years when you were growing up. Suburbanization, for example, was part of the problem. Television, I thought, was a big part of the problem because it privatized our leisure time. But then there was a big unexplained part of that, of why it happened. That is, there's clearly a big difference between the generation before the boomers, that is what other people call the greatest generation, who had it's sort of the parents of the baby boomers, had very, very high levels of social capital in every respect that we're talking about here. More family stability, more community involvement, more friends, and so on. And the boomers. But why that is was a puzzle to me, and it's actually a bigger puzzle now. The easy thought would be to think, well, it was World War II that created that sense of civic obligation, solidarity, and so on, and I think there's something to that. Forgive me now for alluding to coming attractions in response to that question. I'm now at the moment up in the woods of New Hampshire trying to finish a book on that question. Why? Because it hadn't been happening forever. In the previous half of the 20th century, we were getting more and more connected. And then, I'm sorry, sometime in the 60s, there was a turning, and we began to be less and less of all of those things. And why that is, is still a mystery to me. When I finally crack the mystery, I will finish the book, and then I'll be glad to come back and testify. I'm sorry not to be helpful in the answer to that question.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate calling this hearing. But before I begin my question, I just want to briefly address a troubling aspect of this hearing, which we've heard from some of my other members as well. And, you know, essentially, we're here to discuss a very, very serious and valid issue in American society, the issue of building social capital in our communities. And I believe that many people on this dais today would agree that there is both declining trust in the institutions and a declining trust between fellow citizens. And we as lawmakers will play a very important role to help bridge these divides. However, before us today, we have a witness who serves no purpose other than to bring divisiveness to this body. And while I'm sure all of us here believe deeply in freedom of speech and expression, as well as the need for Congress to seek a wide range of opinions and expertise, a witness who has written extensively to promote racist and sexist stereotypes is a needless distraction from what we need to be doing here. To have someone who holds these views elevated alongside actual policy experts before us today is disrespectful to our other witnesses and members of the committee and the important topics that we have to discuss. So with that, I'd like to take a look, a very broad look at what we are facing in this country that I am very concerned about. And that is obviously declining social capital, but I look at it as just declining trust, that we are seeing this erosion of trust in our society that I think has very ominous implications for the democracy that we all love and the republic that we cherish here in the United States. And I've seen that trust over the years of public service that I've had. I was a state legislator for a number of years, then I got out of politics and loved being out of politics for a while. And then when I came back in 2009 in Congress and started holding town hall meetings, this was a period of a few years between those two experiences, the reaction that I got from folks, the vitriol, the anger, the belief in issues irrespective of facts, the change was pretty remarkable in that time period, and we've continued to see it go forward. And I just give an example. During the health care debate, 2009, as we were debating the Affordable Care Act, I had town hall meetings, as some of my colleagues are having town hall meetings today, dealing with the opposite side of that issue. But I remember people screaming and hollering, not wanting to trust any statements that were made. I would even put statements on the board with the actual language of the bill, word for word, that you could get from any source, and people would scream, "You're lying, you're lying." It's like, this is the actual word, these are the facts. And it seems now that we have gone to a world where facts don't matter, that we're in a post-truth world, that all news, if it's not news that people like, then it must be fake news. If you don't like judicial opinions, it's not because you don't agree with the judicial thinking behind the judge, it's because the judge is a so-called judge, or because of the ethnic background of the judge, it can't be critical. This erosion of trust that we continue to see and seems to be accelerated, particularly by particular political leaders who exploit that, I think has very ominous implications for the future of our country. So if our panelists, we'll start maybe with Dr. Putnam, talk a little bit about what you're seeing as an erosion of trust broadly, and what you think that means for us going forward. And these are not issues that are going to be easy to solve as legislators and be able to solve with any one particular federal policy. And you've talked about many policies here today, which are all great. But this is something much bigger than all of that, and we're not seeing it just in the United States. We're seeing it in Europe. We're seeing the kinds of movements, kind of post-truth, post-order kind of movements around the world now. In fact, at the Munich Security Conference that I was at, that was one of the themes, was how do we live in a post-truth world? How do we change that, Dr. Putnam?
Thank you for the question. It's obviously a fundamental one facing our whole country these days. But it's important to understand, I said these days, but it's important to understand that this trend, the trend in declining trust, and I would say trustworthiness too, and reciprocity and mutual esteem, I mean, just being nice to one another, that trend goes back a long ways. That did not begin in 2008. It did not begin in 2016. You pick your date, your political date. It didn't begin then. It's been going down for a long time. And I don't mean that you did, but a lot of commentators talking about that want to put the blame on some particular political person or ideology or moment.
And I don't want to do that.
I know that you don't, and I just want to. I'm insistently wanting to be purple here. This is not caused by particular political actions. If I can be a little academic for a moment, that's what I am. It's important to distinguish, as I lay out in my testimony, between two different kinds of social capital. Social ties that link us to other people like us, and that's called bonding social capital, and social ties that link us to people unlike us. That's called bridging social capital. So my ties to other white, male, elderly Jewish professors, that's my bonding social capital, and my ties to people of a different generation or a different race or a different religion or a different political party, that's my bridging social capital. I'm not saying bridging good, bonding bad, because if you get sick, the people who bring you chicken soup will represent your bonding social capital. But we need a lot of bridging social capital. Democracy needs a ton of bridging social capital. America has in the past been pretty decent about having bridging social capital. Sorry, that's jargon. It just means have good friends who don't share everything about you. There has been a collapse in bridging social capital in America, and part of that is because of this growing physical segregation that Charles Murray has talked about. We're not even living near other people who have different views from us. I think that's the right diagnosis. How to change that is a complicated problem. I don't have any, I could talk a lot about specific policy things, but actually, I think we have to understand that's the fundamental problem. We are just pulling apart as a society, and not just with respect to who shows up at town meetings, but with respect to our daily lives.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Small, Dr. Levin, what about bridging capital? What do we need to do?
So I guess I would say, thank you, Senator. The first thing I would say is I would agree, first of all, that trust in government is down, and also trust in media and news from multiple sources, communication sources, is also down. And as you all know, political polarization is also up. In terms of sort of what to do, I guess part of the way I would think about this question is in terms of the old saying about sunlight being the greatest disinfectant. I think in terms of trust in government, I think an increase in transparency, while it may not reverse the long-term secular trend that Dr. Putnam just referred to, would certainly make a difference. I think strong support from the federal government for science and scientific research that's impartial and objective would also slowly begin to restore faith in certain institutions of government. So I agree that these problems are longer lasting than any single individual or set of people, but I guess I would have a more optimistic view about the potential for short-term actions that are in fact within the power of the Congress to begin to chip away at the distrust in some of our core institutions.
Thank you, Senator, for the question. I think it's a very important facet of this set of trends that that Dr. Putnam and Dr. Murray have described, and I do think Dr. Murray's very important book, Coming Apart, is one way of understanding how this has happened. To me, one way of thinking about an approach to rebuilding trust is to think about how trust is built. And trust is largely built interpersonally. It's not built at a national level all at once, generally speaking. It's built between people. And I think that for us to build up more trust in our political life would require us to allow more of our political life and more of our public policy conversations to happen at the level where people meet each other face to face. And that suggests allowing more power to flow through local institutions and to flow through community institutions. That's a very general answer. It's not a particular policy formula for addressing this problem, but it seems to me that it would help us to turn down the temperature in Washington some so that we don't think of our politics as an endless fight to the death, and it would allow us to speak to each other face to face in ways that make it difficult to treat each other simply as caricatures. It's not always impossible to treat as caricatures people who are sitting right in front of you. I think it happens all the time. I think it's happening now in some respects, but I do think that it's harder, and that ultimately if we allow meaningful policy discussions to happen at levels where people can participate directly, they may be a little more likely to be drawn in. But, you know, that's an answer at the margins, and I wouldn't pretend that it's a solution to the problem simply.
Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for being here. Thank you for testifying. I appreciate your coming before this committee. Dr. Murray, in your testimony, you came to the conclusion that part of the solution for the many challenges we face is likely to be less political and rather cultural. Could you elaborate on this point and in particular give your opinion of the importance of strong families and faith and community life towards improving social capital?
I'm basically going to second what Bob Putnam said earlier, that if we'd gathered people together 20 years ago on issues such as, is religion really important to social capital? Is the family, the traditional family, really important? There would have been a huge divide, depending on the political predilections of the people we're talking about. We have made progress on those fronts. And so now I am not speaking as a person of faith. I'm an agnostic, actually, although I'm wavering in my unbelief. And I am, you know, have been divorced. So in all of those ways, I'm not speaking as a true believer in the institutions of family and faith. I am speaking as a social scientist, as Robert Putnam is, saying this thing called social capital is absolutely crucial to the way that a free society works. It's been the signature of American exceptionalism, actually, from the time of Tocqueville on through the rest of the 19th century and into the 20th century. The way that American communities worked was different from the way communities worked anywhere else in the world, and the reasons we behave differently are captured in social capital as Robert Putnam has described it. And that is going down the tubes. And it's going down the tubes in large part, not entirely, but in large part because the institutions of family and of faith have deteriorated. So once again, I've stated the problem. The progress consists of the much greater consensus that we have now than we had before. That doesn't get us any closer to a solution with one glimmer of hope. The United States has had at least 3 and maybe 4 religious great awakenings, depending on which historian you read. And they had enormous consequences. There was one in the 18th century, there were 2 in the 19th century, maybe 1 in the 1970s. They had enormous consequences for the polity as a whole, and they also came out of nowhere. They coalesced, they had enormous impact, and you really couldn't see it coming. In a way, the civil rights movement reflects the same kind of phenomenon, where the civil rights movement really got going in the mid-1950s, and by 1964 we had the Civil Rights Act. So, if the United States has been able to turn culturally on a dime, when the people sensed that things had gone badly wrong before, it is not inconceivable to me that it will do so again. And I can go no further in being helpful about how that might happen.
Dr. Putnam, would you care to elaborate or amplify on any of those themes?
No, as we have said repeatedly, with respect to the importance of communities of faith and families, I think there's broad consensus among the experts. There's not broad consensus about why the problem has happened. That is, there are different views, even probably among us, about exactly why the family has collapsed and exactly why people have turned away from communities of faith. But and also, I think probably we would all agree, it's not just those 2 institutions. Those are ones that Charles has emphasized, and I agree with that, but it's also true of Rotary clubs and all, you know, bowling leagues and many, many other examples of social capital. If I may, Senator, I'd like to piggyback on some comments that other people have made that I agree with, actually. I do think that this problem, if we reverse engineer, if it's 2020 and we've begun to turn this around, the first signs will be at the state and local level around America. That's where America has in the past fixed its problems. And it involved, and including exactly the period of the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, when there was another great religious fervor during that period. But not only that, it was also the period when labor unions got started. It was a period when most service organizations, Kiwanis and Rotary, and keep going on. It was a period in which there were grassroots solutions to problems very much like the ones we face now. I give it as one example. In response to the growing class gap then, in 1910, Americans in small towns in the heartland invented the high school. The high school, that is free education for everybody in town, all kids in town, was not invented by God. Or if God did it, this is how he did it. In small rural towns, actually, rich folks who had already sent their kids to private secondary education, boarding schools or something, became convinced that other people's kids should also have the access to 4 years of secondary education. It turned out to be the best decision we've ever made, because providing all kids in town with these supports, on the one hand, raised the total productivity of the American labor force so much that that single decision, when it spread nationally, accounts for most of American economic growth throughout the 20th century, and it leveled the playing field. Now, I'm not trying to say, please don't misunderstand me, that the high school, or maybe even any educational reform, is the solution to our problems now. I'm trying to say the process by which we got there was by ordinary folks in ordinary towns where they were meeting face to face, and where they weren't, there was a lot of public division then. I'm talking about 1900, 1910, big political turmoil, but people in face-to-face communities were able to put that aside and say, okay, let that noise go on. How can we fix things here? My hope, actually, that we could begin as a country to turn this around is that as I go around the country talking to people, and especially in local communities, there's at the grassroots, a lot of hope that things can begin to happen. Now, will all the problems be completely solved at the local level? Absolutely not. We're going to need, at some point, there are going to be some successes that come out of that period of new experimentation, and then we're going to say, well, okay, that turns out to be really great, and let's do that every place. So I'm not saying that all these problems in the end are going to be solved at the national level, at the local level, without national policies, but I am saying that that's where I think I would look for opportunities for making real progress, a little bit outside to use language I used earlier, to look for purple solutions to this problem, not just red or blue solutions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cruz. I want to thank each of our witnesses today. We decided to hold this hearing because it's on an important topic, and because it's such an important topic, we sought to assemble 4 of the top experts in the entire country on this issue, and that is exactly what we did. This panel would have been incomplete without any one of you, and I'm grateful to each of you for being here and for your willingness to reach out and identify issues that have gone unaddressed for too long, that have not been always socially popular, that have not always been on the cutting edge of getting news, and that sometimes do get news, but perhaps not in the ways that anyone had intended at the outset. I appreciate your willingness to be here today and to inform us, and for your academic integrity and your objective, which is to identify issues that too often go unaddressed and are often ignored in our quest to address other more sexy, more popular, more palatable issues. These are difficult questions, and I deeply appreciate your willingness to shed light on them for our committee. The record will remain open for 5 business days. For any member who would like to submit questions for the record, the hearing is adjourned.